tonight, I'm really excited. We have Erica LeMoine from LoonWatch. We all know how cool it is to go camping up north and be in the Northwoods and hear the loons in your tent at night. The loon is a sentinel species and a symbol of clean water and good fisheries and healthy aquatic ecosystems. Since 1978, LoonWatch has been protecting common loons and their habitats with education and monitoring research. Erica has headed up LoonWatch since 2011, and she does a lot of work, including work with more than 500 citizen scientists who help in research on the loons. So I'm really excited to have her. I saw her presentation at Canoecopia, and I'm glad we were able to get her for us tonight. So welcome, Erica.
Thank you, Fred, and thank you so much for inviting me. The more I learn about this group, the more excited I am. So I hope that you all will enjoy this presentation. So I would like to thank the Minnesota Rovers, first and foremost, for allowing me to give a presentation about our wonderful symbol of Northern Lakes, the common loon. And I'd like to thank you all for joining me. I know there are a lot of people who chose to join us for the presentation tonight. LoonWatch is based at Northland College in Ashland, Wisconsin. And again, my name is Erica LeMoine, and I've been directing the LoonWatch program for 10 years. And I've been working with citizen scientists for about 20 years now. So this presentation is a bit of a loon primer. So I'm going to be covering a lot of information. If you have questions after the presentation is over, please don't hesitate to contact me via the email or phone number you see on this slide. So during the presentation, I'm going to be covering basics about loons, ecology, migration, habitat, behavior, current and recent research, threats to loons, and what you guys can do to protect loons too. So as Fran mentioned, LoonWatch got its start back in 1978. And I just wanted to give you a little background about that. It was actually 24 citizen scientists who wanted to know a little bit more about what was happening with the loon population back then. And they started monitoring a bunch of lakes in northern Wisconsin. Since then, LoonWatch has expanded, and the program now includes 2 volunteer citizen science programs that comprise over 500 volunteers. As Fran mentioned, she really did a good introduction. There's a Speakers Bureau program, a Get the Let Out program, a grant program, an annual photo contest, and an educational poster that goes along with that photo contest. So I provide educational outreach programming throughout Wisconsin and the upper Midwest. And recently I've provided programming as far away as South Carolina and Colorado. So this virtual format has really allowed me to expand our programming and get the word out about our beautiful loon here in the Midwest. So currently I am actually limited to virtual programming. I am so looking forward to the day. So when I can meet folks in person and have that in-person contact, which I think is a lot better than this in some respects, but in other respects, we are able to do this, and it's great. And it's great that it gets recorded too. So this is our subject tonight, the beautiful common loon. This loon is in its beautiful breeding plumage. The loons are truly water birds. They spend their entire lives on the water, except for a short time during the breeding season when they come to shore to nest. So the common loon, it measures about 30 inches from head to tail, has approximately a 5-foot wingspan, and adults weigh anywhere from 6 to 13 pounds. So they're a pretty sizable bird when you see them on the water, relatively up close. Don't encourage you to get super close, but it's I think surprising to a lot of people how large they are. So when you're on our northern lakes and you view a loon, they dive a lot, and their dives typically last for 45 seconds to a minute. But I think when you're looking for them to come back up, it seems like a lot more time passes than that. But it's usually approximately that time. But during migration, our loons stage on the Great Lakes, and they make dives up to 5 minutes long and up to 200 feet deep. So they're really incredible swimmers. So including the common loon, there are actually 5 species of loons that are all found in the Northern Hemisphere. So the yellow-billed loon is the most closely related to the common loon, and it is the largest loon species. It's found in tundra areas along the ocean's north slope of Alaska, the Northwest Territories in Canada, and in Russia. So the Pacific loon is found in the New World, and it's the most commonly viewed loon in Alaska. So you're more likely to see a Pacific loon if you're in Alaska than a common loon if you're in Alaska. The Arctic loon looks almost identical to the Pacific loon, but they differ in the color of their neck iridescence. And the Arctic loon is only found in the Old World. And then the red-throated loon is the smallest loon species. It's the only species that can take off from a sitting position. And it is the one species that we might see as it's migrating through the Great Lakes. Typically during the Chequamegon Bay Birding and Nature Festival that's up in Ashland, we see those out on the bay around mid-May when they're migrating through. So the red-throated loon, we find those in the tundra ecosystems across North America, Asia, and Scandinavia. So here is our common loon, and as you can see in this photo, the loon's legs are located far back on their body. And when they fly, they're pretty distinctive, that they have that real distinctive hunchbacked kind of shape. So loons, like I mentioned, they are water birds. They are actually not closely related to ducks. They are more closely related to penguins and tube-nosed birds such as albatrosses, petrels, and shearwaters. So while ducks, as you can see, they can walk on land, loons cannot because of the placement of their hind limbs. You're only going to see a healthy loon on land when it is nesting. So loons are excellent swimmers. Unlike most birds, they have solid bones that make them less buoyant and better at deep dives. When they dive, they compress their feathers, they expel air from their lungs, and they hold their wings at their side, and they use their very powerful legs to propel them. They have streamlined bodies, and so they're very speedy and efficient, and that makes them excellent predators. Their main prey being fish that are 10 inches or in size or less. So this video of a common loon swimming underwater was filmed at a rehabilitation pool at the Tufts Veterinary Wildlife Clinic. To give you an idea of how fast this loon was actually moving, this footage was recorded at 200 frames per second, and it's being played back at 30 frames per second, appearing 6.7 times slower than in real life. So this loon would just zoom by if you saw it in real life. So folks, this is what a loon looks like on land. It cannot walk. It'll scoot using its wings and feet, but it's going to scrape and injure itself, especially on a paved surface like this. So why is this loon on a paved surface? Because unfortunately, migration can be a hazardous time for loons, and it has everything to do with man-made trips. So occasionally loons land on these large wet parking lots or flooded agricultural fields because they mistake them for large bodies of water. So they're helpless and vulnerable at this stage, and only the lucky ones are going to be rescued by humans. Others that are not so lucky will succumb to predation or to the elements. Someone in the rovers mentioned this slide. So loons are a heavy bird for their wing to weight ratio. They require about a quarter-mile aquatic runway to be able to achieve flight unless they're aided by a headwind. And usually in the fall, during migration, we get these storms, these nor'easters, and that helps them to be able to fly. So you'll see loons and a lot of other birds flying when we have these storm events. So I took these photos of a loon chick when I was with some researchers who were banding loons. And Doug, who's in the yellow sweatshirt there, he's holding this loon upright at my request to show how similar this loon looks to one of its nearest relatives. So many people think that loons are ducks, but as I said before, they are actually more closely related to penguins and tube-nosed birds. And I think that looks pretty well evidenced here in this photo. So this is a worldwide map of the common loon's range. So the breeding range is in the light gray areas, and the wintering range is in the dark gray areas. Worldwide, there are approximately 634,000 common loons. 93% of common loons worldwide have their breeding range in Canada. So Canada is home to approximately 592,000 loons. 6% have their breeding range in the United States with about 37,000 loons. And then the remaining 1% have breeding range in Greenland and Iceland with approximately 5,500 loons. Slightly different map. This is the range and migration map just for North America. This isn't worldwide. And so you can see a little bit more clearly the breeding range are the blue areas, the winter range are the orange areas, and those pink arrows show the migration routes. So we are at the southernmost edge of the common loons breeding range, which means as loons are affected by climate change more and more, we're seeing it here first. And then loons from our area tend to migrate mostly down to the Gulf of Mexico. A few of them utilize the Atlantic Bight area for their wintering grounds. So this is the common loon distribution in Minnesota as shown by the Minnesota Breeding Bird Atlas. And so to interpret this, the squares are townships. And so the kind of yellow-orange, the light green and the blue squares indicate areas where there is likely nesting loons, and then those bright green ones are areas where loons were observed without nesting. So there are a lot of loons nesting in Minnesota. That's why we have it as our state bird. So loons are harbingers of spring, really. They usually arrive to their lakes right around the time of ice out. And when they return to their breeding lakes, they usually try to establish territory too. So the loon pictured here is not on a breeding lake, it's on a stopover lake. So this is Lake Monona in Madison, Wisconsin. Loons don't breed that far south. So one of our loon rangers took the shot in early April of 2014. So this year was a lot different. We had a very early ice out up here. So you can almost imagine, see the loon at the bottom of the photo there, you can almost imagine that this loon is willing the ice to melt. So as loons fly north, they look for open water. And if their destination lake is still frozen, they're going to fly back to the nearest open water and try again later, which is why they arrive right around ice out. So loon vocalizations have specific meanings, and you're going to hear a series of 5 different vocalizations. I'm going to describe the call first, and then I'm going to play the call. And I need you to have a little bit of patience because I have to toggle between 2 different audio settings to play the call and then for you to hear me. So the first vocalization obviously is the yodel. The yodel is only given by the male loon. So if you see a loon give this call, it's probably one of the only times you're going to be able to distinguish between male and female. And the yodel is a territorial call. So this male loon is saying, hey, this is my property, back off. I'm going to defend my territory here. And he has to stick out his neck in the snake-like position to be able to give this call. So that was the territorial yodel that you just heard. So the next 4 calls that I'm going to play are made by both the male and female loon. And so the wail, it sounds similar to a wolf howl, and we tend to hear this at dawn and dusk. And I think this is a call that a lot of people are familiar with. So loons use this vocalization when they're trying to find each other. So it's kind of the loon saying, hey, where are you? Parent loons use this also to try and find their chicks. And this call can also be used for a specific predator, the bald eagle. So when it vocalizes to warn of an eagle, it sounds a little bit different. It's a 3-note call that's higher in pitch and faster in cadence. I'm going to play the wail here. So the tremolo is a loon's distress call. So if it's having an especially nervous moment, you might hear it do this call. So it could be that a predator is close by, or if we humans are too close, you might hear the tremolo. So at LoonWatch, we like to recommend using the 200-foot rule and keeping a distance of about 200 feet from loons to allow them to do their natural behavior. I'm going to play the tremolo. And then the in-flight tremolo is similar to the tremolo, but it's given by loons that are flying over a lake to see if it's okay to land. So if there's a vocalization from other loons in response, then that loon that's flying over is going to have to make a determination about whether or not it's safe to land. And then this last call I'm going to play is the hoot, and it's the shortest call, and it's a very sweet sounding vocalization. So this is when a loon is saying, hey, hello there. Oftentimes loons will communicate when they're hanging out in large groups called rafts during migration. Parents also use this call to encourage their chicks. So loons have a lot of different predators, and eagles, bald eagles, are probably one of the most common predators of our loons. They have a millennia worth of predator-prey relationship, and the bald eagle is one of those predators that can take the loon eggs, the chicks, and also adults if they're not doing too well. Other predators like crows, gulls, and raccoons are not necessarily natural predators of loon eggs. They tend to be brought to lakeshore areas because of the presence of humans. When we have a lot of development on a lakeshore, folks have refuse there, and that attracts those types of predators. Mink will also take loon eggs, and then snapping turtles and predatory fish like muskie, northern, and large bass will chomp up those cute little fuzzy little young loon chicks too. So loons typically lay 1 to 2 eggs during the nesting season, which begins in mid-May. So loons will incubate their nest for 26 to 30 days. If for some reason the first nesting attempt is successful, then they might try a second time or even a third time until about late June. This year might be a little bit different. We had ice out on a lot of our northern lakes up here around the end of March. And so loons typically arrive in mid-April, and then they start nesting in mid-May. They have usually a month where they need to replenish their energy to reserves because they've just had a 1,200 to 1,500 mile migration. So because some of them did arrive earlier, we might see some early nesting. So we might see some loons starting to nest in the beginning of May. So what do loons look for in breeding territory? They like these natural shaped shorelines and natural vegetation, irregular shaped shorelines, I should say. They like places that are pretty quiet, that don't have human habitation. And they nest, as you can see in this picture, they nest right next to the shoreline. So it's really important for them to have easy access to the water. And they love these hummocky islands. Bog mats and hummocky islands like this are preferential to loons. May not look like great habitat to us, but they can have a 360-degree view of their surroundings, which means that they can see a predator coming from a long distance away. And loons use their very sharp bill as defense against those predators. So this is a very good place for a loon to be nesting. So if 2 eggs are laid, the chicks are going to hatch in the order that they're laid. So you can see one chick in front of the nest being taken care of by a parent, and the other chick is still being brooded by a loon that's on top of the nest. So the second egg is usually laid a day later than the first egg, and they hatch in the order that they're laid. If that second egg doesn't hatch after a couple of days, those parents will take off with that young chick and leave the egg there, and it's probably not a viable egg then. So both the male and female of a territorial pair will take care of the eggs and the chicks. So you can see them, they're incredible parents. You will see them just ferociously almost feeding their chicks. So loons have a number of different defensive postures. When a loon feels threatened, especially on the nest, their first reaction is to try and remain inconspicuous. And so this is called the hangover posture. This loon is trying to be inconspicuous on the nest, and it's trying to hide from whatever threat it feels. If the threat continues, it might leave the nest, and it'll leave the eggs exposed and exposed to potential predation and to the elements until it feels safe. So it's not going to come back to the nest until it feels safe. If it is suddenly threatened, loons incubate the eggs on top of their feet. And if it's suddenly threatened, it may leave the nest very quickly, and those eggs may go into the water with it. And so then the nest is no longer viable. And from a distance, loons really blend in well with their environment. So as you can see, there's a loon nesting here. It's in the hangover position. Probably whoever has taken this picture was too close. And so this is a warning. So if you see a loon doing this, it's a warning for you to back off and give the loon some space. Again, at LoonWatch, we recommend the 200-foot rule. It's also good etiquette to try and canoe a good distance from shore if you are in a canoe or kayak, because that's a situation where the loon might not hear you approaching, and to give that loon some space, especially during nesting season, which is May through early July. So this is another defensive posture, and I call this the submarine pose. So again, this loon is trying to be inconspicuous. It has expelled some air from its lungs. It's compressed its feathers so it can lay as flat as possible to the water surface. So this is a sure sign that you are way too close to this loon, and you're probably too close to its nest. So this loon is basically saying, you don't see me and you don't see my nest. This is actually an artificial nesting platform. And again, parents will teach their chicks to do this as well. So this chick is doing the same thing. It's trying to compress its feathers and expel air and trying to be as flat to the surface of the water as possible. So usually you see the parents give some sort of vocalization to warn the chick of danger. So it might be that a predator is too close. It might also be that that other loons are too close. So there can be intruding loons that can threaten a chick. Usually the chick will go to an area of emergent vegetation. If that isn't nearby, then it'll probably do this. So it's an indication, again, if you see a loon doing this, you're probably a bit too close. And then if a loon feels especially threatened, it will do something we call the penguin dance. So the loon will expend a lot of energy during the penguin dance, energy that it could have been using to find prey and to raise and defend its chicks. Oftentimes a loon will engage in a penguin dance during a territorial dispute with another loon, so they will chase each other. But if humans are too close and are chasing a loon, it'll do this too because it feels threatened and it's scared and it's trying to get away. So if you see someone causing this, they may not think that they're doing something wrong, but it's a good thing to have an educational moment if you feel comfortable and let folks know that this is not a good thing to do. So as I said before, both the male and female loons help rear the chicks. And during their first 2 weeks of life, the chicks are especially vulnerable to predation in the elements. So adult loons have a very well-developed oil gland called a uropygeal gland. And you'll see them reaching toward the back part of their body. What they're doing is grabbing oil, and they're using that oil to preen their feathers and waterproof their feathers. The little chicks don't really have that. So they need to stay on top of their parents to stay warm and to stay protected. And when they are this age, when they are just hatched, the parents, if their nest isn't in an area where there's a lot of emergent vegetation, the parents will take them to what they call a nursery. And that's an area where there's a lot of emergent vegetation where they can find small prey items like minnows and macroinvertebrates to feed those chicks. And the parents will constantly be putting food items right up to their chicks' bills. Sometimes the chicks refuse it, probably because they're too full. So very young chicks can be difficult to see from a distance. They do spend a lot of time, not just on the backs of their parents, but under their parents' wings. So this is another reason when you're in a canoe or kayak and during nesting and chick rearing season, to give loons a wide berth so that they feel comfortable and they do their natural behaviors. So this is an adorable 1-day-old newly hatched chick. They're little gray downy fluff balls, and they can dive, but they pop back up like little corks. So they can't dive deep at all at this stage. They're completely dependent on their parents for food and protection right now too. So this is an interesting age. This is a 6-week-old chick. And at this age, the downy feathers are being gradually replaced by contour feathers and flight feathers. And the parents' interaction with the chicks is very interesting too. Oftentimes you'll see the parents, instead of bringing food right up to their chicks, they'll bring them half-dead prey items. And this is helping the chicks learn how to hunt. So at 12 weeks old, the chicks are considered to be fully fledged. This is a juvenile chick. And they can take care of themselves, they can fly, they can do everything that other adult loons can do. However, you'll probably see them still chasing their parents around the lake if their parents are still there and begging for a meal. And when the parents finally migrate, I'll hear from the loon rangers, and they'll be very concerned about their chicks. But these chicks are hardwired for migration, so they do not have any problems with migration. They don't need their parents to migrate. But it's very interesting the order in which the loons do migrate. So the first loons to migrate are floaters. Floaters are loons that are not part of a territorial pair. And so they usually migrate in August and September. The loon parents start migrating in September and October. And then the chicks are the last to leave because they have to get their energy supplies ready. They have to really do a lot of feeding for this 1,200 mile to 1,500 mile migration that they've got. So they usually leave in November and even into December, which does worry a lot of loon rangers, the volunteers who monitor loons. But as long as there's open water, those chicks are fine. So there is some current research happening in northern Wisconsin that is very interesting. Walter Piper runs the Loon Project, and he has been monitoring loons in Oneida County, that's that orange county highlighted there, since 1993. He's been monitoring approximately 100 lakes in Oneida County. He's based in Chapman University in Orange, California, but he comes to Wisconsin every single year to do his project. And of late, his project has really been focused on loon behavior. But of late, he's looked back at his body of work, at his at all of the data that he's collected. And over the years, his data is now showing lower rates of chick production, poorer conditions of the chicks that are produced, and fewer chicks that are returning to their natal lakes. His data is also indicating a decreasing floater population. So again, those are the loons that are not part of a territorial pair. And this is very concerning for the future of the loon population here in Wisconsin. And I talk a lot with Walter. Actually, loon researchers and citizen science project coordinators across the United States, we talk to each other quite a bit. And LoonWatch does a project called the Wisconsin Loon Population Survey. And our latest results from 2020 for the first time show a slightly decreasing loon population in Wisconsin. And so that kind of does agree with what Walter is seeing out there, but the 2025 and 2030 population surveys are going to be very critical. So this is a long time population survey. We've been doing this once every 5 years since 1985. And we also get the chick population too. But as you can see, the chick population really varies from year to year. And that is because of all the different pressures on chicks. So there's a lot of different pressures and a lot higher mortality of chicks from year to year. And so it's difficult to say that there's going to be an increasing or decreasing population just based on 1 year of gathering chick data. So some recent research that is very interesting that also occurred not only in Wisconsin, but also in Minnesota is the Common Loon Migration Study. So in 2010, so that's an important year, in 2010 and 2011, a total of 31 adult loons were radio marked on lakes in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan as a part of a common loon migration study that was coordinated by Kevin Keno. He's the primary researcher. He's with the U.S. Geological Survey. So on those radio marked loons, Kevin was able to retrieve exact locations because satellites receive a signal from the radio tag and they are able to triangulate the location. So all the loons in this study used Lake Michigan as a staging area. They stayed there for 2 weeks to a month during migration. Loons also, as you can see, they used lakes and reservoirs on their journey down to the Gulf of Mexico. They used these lakes and reservoirs in Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, and Georgia. Almost all of the loons in the study migrated to the Gulf of Mexico. And again, a few were utilizing that South Atlantic Bight region as their wintering area. So what prompted this tagging study? The USGS, the Upper Midwest Environmental Sciences Center, which is where Kevin Keno is based, they had been tracking avian botulism outbreaks on the Great Lakes. And they wanted to know if our Midwestern loons were being affected during their migration. So over the past 50 years, over 100,000 birds have died because of type E botulism on the Great Lakes. And this map indicates the areas where those botulism outbreaks occurred. And actually, Kevin's research, Kevin's satellite tagged loons, were going to those same areas on Lake Michigan. So 96% of the satellite tagged loons used Lake Michigan as a staging area and were staging in areas where those botulism outbreaks had occurred. So that really gave them a lot of information. Aha. Exactly 11 years ago today, on April 20th, 2010, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill occurred. So there were many loons that were killed because of this oil spill. And the initial purpose of the Common Loon Migration Study was to determine if our loons were in areas where botulism outbreaks were occurring. Serendipitously, if you want to call it that, this oil spill happened in 2010. So Kevin had no way of knowing that this was going to happen. He had to prepare years ahead of time to get all of the resources together for this botulism study. But this oil spill occurred, and Kevin and his team were very concerned about the loons. We know that the adult loons returned to northern Minnesota, to the northern Midwest by April 20th. However, our juvenile loons do not come back until 3 years later. So because of band returns, researchers knew that our juvenile loons probably didn't stay in the Gulf of Mexico the entire time, but at some point they migrate up the Atlantic coast to the cooler waters of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, which is near Nova Scotia. But little is known about their movements and the timing of their movements. We just know that during summertime that we've seen these band returns. So to see if our juvenile loons were exposed to this oil spill in 2014 and 2015, Kevin and his crew equipped 22 juvenile loons with these satellite tags. So this map shows the location where Minnesota juvenile loons were tagged. There were 15 of them tagged in Minnesota. And the results were very interesting. And as you can see, this indicated that our juvenile loons do migrate up the coast to the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So just take a look at this map. The black X's show the path that the juvenile loon took to the Gulf of Mexico. So note that the juvenile did not stage on Lake Michigan like the adults do. So that is So interesting. That's probably learned behavior. So this juvenile arrived to the Gulf of Mexico on November 13th. You can see that it left Tamarack Lake on November 8th. It only took 5 days to get down to the Gulf of Mexico. And it stayed in the Gulf of Mexico until April 16th. So our juvenile loons are probably staying until the middle of April. So what happens down in the Gulf of Mexico in April? It starts to get pretty darn warm down there. So as you can see on April 16th, let me get my cursor here. This juvenile started moving up the Atlantic coast until it arrived to the Gulf of St. Lawrence by May 29th. And then it stayed there until September 14th. And then it started moving back down to the Gulf of Mexico, much more slowly this time, and arrived at the Gulf of Mexico on December 6th. So our juvenile loons are not just staying put in the Gulf of Mexico when they migrate down. They're doing a couple of these trips up and down until finally, when they are sexually mature at about 3 years old, they come back to close to their natal lakes in the northern Midwest. So just fascinating. But our juvenile loons were potentially exposed to these petroleum products. So another thing that Kevin and his crew did was take blood and feather samples. So they wanted to see if our loons in Minnesota were exposed to petroleum contamination from the Gulf of Mexico. So blood and feather samples were taken from live loons that were captured by Geological Survey staff in the course of placing or recovering these geolocator tags and satellite transmitters. So this happened in Minnesota. That's when they took these samples. So the analysis of the blood and feather samples was carried out by the Center of Environmental Sciences and Engineering at the University of Connecticut. Why didn't they do this in Minnesota? Because Connecticut has access to original samples of oil spilled during the Deepwater Horizon incident. So unique petroleum features found in Minnesota can be matched to the fingerprint characteristics of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. So we know that the oil spill had an impact on our loons. So 18 of 42 blood, feather, and fat samples from loons contained petroleum contaminants from the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. 4 of 29 unhatched eggs also contained contaminants from the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. So that oil spill definitely had an impact on our loons. So now we're talking threats. As if the oil spill isn't threat enough, loons face a myriad of threats. Probably the biggest threat is loss of habitat. So this is an interesting map. This shows the historical breeding range and the present breeding range of the common loon in North America. And that dashed line is the historical southern limit of where loons used to breed in North America. They used to breed in northern Ohio, northern Indiana, northern Illinois, and even in Iowa. But our development really, and poor water quality really pushed them to the northern regions where they are today. So that's the area where all those small dots are. That's where they are today. And somewhat going hand in hand with development often is poor water quality. So as Fran mentioned, loons are sentinel species. They are indicators of healthy aquatic ecosystems. Loons are visual predators, and they need clear, clean water to see and pursue their prey. So they are more likely to be found on lakes with good water clarity. So water clarity means how far down you can see in the lake. And that is demonstrated by this chart down here on the right-hand side of your screen. And I'm just going to interpret that for you. The column on the far right indicates greater than 20 feet of water clarity. And as you go to the left from that, it's less and less water clarity. And the column on the far left is less than 5 feet of water clarity. So if you look down, you would see greater than 20 feet down in your lake with that column. And with this column, if you look down, you would see less than 5 feet down in your lake. The y-axis is the percentage of occupancy by loons. So to interpret this chart, On lakes that have greater than 20 feet of water clarity, 70% of those lakes are occupied by loons. And as you go down, even less and less loons to lakes that have less than 5 feet of water clarity, only 20% of those lakes are occupied by loons. So there is a direct correlation between water clarity and loon occupancy. On lakes that have less than 2.5 feet of water clarity, you're not going to find loons on those lakes. So another threat, unfortunately, is fishing tackle, lead fishing tackle. So in Wisconsin, approximately 20% of necropsied loons died because of lead poisoning from lead fishing tackle. In Minnesota, I think it's closer to 30%. And I know that Minnesota is doing great things right now and trying to change laws when it pertains to lead fishing tackle. So it only takes one really small lead shot to be able to kill a loon. So that death is painful and it happens within 2 to 3 weeks. How do loons ingest lead fishing tackle? There are 3 different ways mainly that they ingest lead fishing tackle, because they're chasing and catching fish that have lead tackle attached to them, because they're picking up pebbles from the lake bed. So oftentimes they'll encounter, unfortunately, lead tackle on the lake bed. They pick up pebbles to put into an organ called the gizzard. And the gizzard is kind of like the loon's teeth. So that's an organ that grinds up their food. So they have to constantly be picking up pebbles. And then if people are fishing too close to loons, the loon might chase the bait. And oftentimes fishermen will cut the line. And then not only is the loon ingesting the lead tackle, but it's also getting entangled in fishing line. And fishing line is also a big threat too. So they're very susceptible to monofilament line entanglement because of their prey item, and they might not be able to eat, swim, dive, or fly when they become entangled in fishing line. So another threat is human boating disturbance. So especially during nesting season and when chicks are very young, both the nests and the chicks are vulnerable. And I think that the top 2 boats look pretty obvious as a threat. So as I mentioned before, those very young chicks are unable to dive deep, and they are threatened by being run over by these fast moving boats, especially if people are paying attention. And then when the parents are carrying the young on their back, they can also run over the parents and the chicks. And we had, unfortunately, some of that happened this past summer. There was a lot more people and recreation up on our lakes than we've ever seen before. So this is something that we really need to address, and hoping that that this presentation will help you be able to talk to people about that. Additionally, the wakes that are produced by boats can be threatening to loon nests. If they're producing a wake that's too close to shore, it can wash out a loon nest. I think less obvious are those slow-moving water sports, right? The ones that we like a lot, the kayaks and the canoes. Well, in habitat that looks just like that in the pictures, that's where loons nest. And so we need to give those areas a wide berth, especially during nesting season, because if you startle a loon off the nest, it may not come back until it feels safe, or could potentially take those eggs into the lake with it. So emerging threat. Some of you may be familiar with the Audubon climate change maps. They've made these for hundreds of bird species. This particular map series is for the common loon. These maps were created based on Audubon's climate change model for the common loon, and they start in the year 2000 and they go through 2080. So according to Audubon, by 2080, loons are forecast to lose 56% of their current summer range and 75% of their current winter range. So the yellow areas are the summer range, and the blue areas are the winter range. And I'm going to click through so that you can see as they go through the different years. So this is 2000, 2020. By 2050, we don't really have many loons left in the lower 48. And by 2080, as they're predicting, we probably won't have breeding loons in the lower 48, but we'll probably have wintering loons here in the lower 48. So Audubon scientists used two main factors to develop their model: temperature and precipitation, as well as the projected future climate based on the report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So their projection is probably a simple estimate and not a precise one. It doesn't take into consideration other important factors to the presence of loons, like water quality or lake levels or recreation, type of lake or lake development. So those are all important to the presence of loons. So with all this gloom and doom, what can be done to protect loons? There are a number of actions that we can take. If you are lucky enough to own lake property, you can replace just the first 15 feet of your shoreline with native plants. So the deep root systems of native plants not only slow runoff from rainfall, but they filter and cool the water before it gets to the lake. So heat speeds up chemical reactions such as algal blooms. And algal blooms have the detrimental effect of reducing water clarity and oxygen. So this is something that anyone who lives on a lake can easily do. And then getting the lead out of your tackle box. So LoonWatch is making this much easier. If you go to our website, we have a 3-page list of non-lead manufacturers and retailers. It's a PDF. You can download that. You can print it out, take it to your local tackle supplier. If they don't have non-lead tackle, they have no excuse now, and they really should be starting to get that in, and especially in Minnesota if the laws are going to change. And so there are a lot of different alternatives to lead. Some of the common ones are steel, tungsten, bismuth, and tin. Tungsten is a little bit more expensive, but the others are similar price now to lead because there's a lot of it out there. So talk to your fellow fishermen or anyone who you know fishes, and maybe as a birthday present or a Christmas present, buy them some non-lead tackle as a hint. Also, it is important to properly dispose of fishing lines. So in Wisconsin, some of the DNR centers in Wisconsin have these, on the right side, you see these are monofilament line recycling bins. I don't think we have that in Minnesota, but what you can do to keep wildlife safe is to cut your monofilament line into 6-inch lengths, and wildlife won't get entangled in monofilament line when it's cut to those lengths. What else can you do? Especially during nesting season, try to stay as far away from undeveloped shoreline as possible so you avoid startling nesting loons. Use that 200-foot rule. I highly recommend getting a good pair of binoculars if you want to view the loons. Then you can have a good clear view of the loons, or a spotting scope if you're looking from shore, or like Linda has in this picture, a camera with a gigantic zoom lens. So there are a lot of other options that you can do and be helping to protect loons. And going back to that oil spill, reducing our oil dependency may also reduce oil spills that are deadly to wildlife. So doing these good practices is actually going to help loons and other wildlife, as well as slowing climate change. And please support alternative energy as much as you can too. And become loon ambassador. So I'm asking everyone that is attending this presentation tonight to please help protect loons by sharing what you learned, and helping the Minnesota DNR especially, because they're the ones that are running the loon monitoring programs and helping to protect loons in Minnesota. And you can, if you're interested, join the Minnesota Loon Monitoring Program that's run by the Department of Natural Resources. That's the web link there. But if you just Google Minnesota Loon Monitoring, you'll be able to get this webpage as well. And I didn't know if you were aware of this, but you can support the brand new National Loon Center that's going into Cross Lake, Minnesota. It has not been built yet. They're raising money to build the center, but that's very exciting. It's so exciting to have a National Loon Center so close to us. And then Walter Piper, the researcher that I mentioned, he's actually starting a population monitoring on the whitefish chain this summer so that he can compare what he's learning in Oneida County to what's happening here in Minnesota. So very exciting. So with that, I'd also like to encourage you to support LoonWatch. that allows me to be able to provide this type of programming to other groups as well. And I'd like to end with a quote from a former LoonWatch coordinator, Terry Dalton. She ran this program in the 1990s. And she said the intensive nurturing, observation, and protection provided to loons by volunteers across the continent is unprecedented. What loon rangers are protecting is not just loons, but a whole aesthetic. The loon, the forested shores, the clear, cold water. And so as loon ambassadors, right, you all are becoming loon ambassadors, you're going to be doing that too. So I'd like to end this presentation and open it up to questions if there's time for questions too.
There is absolutely time for questions. So if anyone has any questions, please unmute yourself and ask them.
I was just wondering about the loon breeding season, or when you try the nesting season, I guess is probably the proper term, so you can avoid that time. Thank you.
Yes. So loons typically start nesting around mid-May, and they may go, depending on if they have more than one nesting attempt, they may go as late as early July. So that's when you want to really try to avoid those nesting areas. And then if you know someone on the lake who lives there, they might know where loons are nesting. And so they can give you a really specific area to avoid so that you don't have to avoid all those areas.
And you're saying it's on the shore? They're normally on the shoreline where they are?
Right, they nest right next to the water. So you can see in those pictures that they're nesting right next to the water within about 6 to 12 inches of the water line.
Okay.
So I'm not sure if I missed this, but about how many pairs of nesting loons do you get on a typical lake?
Oh, that's a great question. So it depends on the lake. Loons are very territorial, so they won't accept seeing other loons in their territory. So if it's a small lake where you can see all parts of the lake from one vantage point, you're only going to have one pair of loons. But if it's a larger lake where there are islands and bays and there's plenty of nesting habitat and good prey availability, you can have more than one pair of loons. Loon territories are typically anywhere from 50 to 150 acres in size on those larger lakes. That's a great question. Thank you.
Erica, are the loons, how much damage occurs to loons from lost hooks, lost fishing line, things like that? Like, I imagine it goes to the bottom of the lake as well.
Right. So it's hard to distinguish where the loons are picking up the lead tackle. So we don't know exactly from lost fishing tackle how many are dying from lead poisoning. We do know that in Wisconsin, about 20% of loons that were necropsied died because of lead poisoning, and in Minnesota, about 30%. I don't know that extrapolates to the loon population, but that is a huge percentage out of the loons that are necropsied that are dying from lead tackle.
Are there some found with hooks in their stomachs or lines wrapped on them, things like that?
Yes. And let me see if I can take you back to that photograph. Can you guys see that? I'm still sharing. So you can see that those stomach contents, that's a hook right there, and a bunch of tackle in that x-ray of that loon's stomach contents.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So there's a question in the chat, Erica. Do loons mate for life?
Oh, that's such a good question. I could talk for hours about this, but actually loons are more married to their territory than they are to each other. So they don't mate for life. If a lot of those I mentioned, those floaters, those can become intrusions, and those intrusions can result in territorial disputes. So it's always a male versus a male, or a female versus a female during those territorial disputes. So it's never the opposite sex. And if it's two males that are disputing territory, the female is going to sit back and watch. And so if the intruding male wins this territorial battle, the female will go with that new male, even if she's been with that resident male for 10 to 15 years, because it's not really the resident male that is making the difference for them being successful in producing chicks. It's that awesome territory. So if they have really good nesting habitat, abundant prey, quiet part of the lake to nest on, good water quality, that becomes really valuable territory. And that's where they want to be, rather than with their mate. If that makes sense. So, I have a couple of things that help you remember that. So it's all about, it's sort of a real estate thing. It's all about location, location, location. And then think of Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young song, if you can't be with the one you love the one you're with. A good way to remember loons.
Very good.
Hi, Erica. This is Jane. Thank you for your presentation. Loons are my absolute favorite. It reminds me of canoe trips up north. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, a couple of years ago, I was in St. Augustine, Florida in April, and another rover and I were on a boat that we were the only two on the boat with the guide, and we were buzzing around St. Augustine, and we came upon a loon, and the guide said, well, what kind of a bird is that? I've never seen that. And we said, well, that's a loon. No, that's not a loon. And we totally, trust us, we're from Minnesota. So we, looked at that loon for a while, wondering why it was still down there in April. And then she took us somewhere else and she said, no, see, here's a bunch of loons. And to us, they look like mergansers. And that we started Googling when we got back to the hotel. And that's when I learned that they shed their little tuxedos when they leave here.
Yes.
Which was, I don't know if I'm the only one that didn't know that, but that was a complete surprise. So can you talk a little bit about that? We were fascinated by that.
Absolutely. And I have more pictures on other slide presentations I wish I could show you. And if you want, I can share those with you at a later date. But yes, loons molt in the fall. And if the adult loons are staying later into the fall, especially those parent loons, you'll see that. They almost look like a Labrador retriever as they're getting older. They start molting on their face. They start getting these white feathers. And eventually they acquire, instead of the beautiful black and white plumage that we see up here, they get this sort of brownish gray plumage. And that's what people down in Florida see. So it's almost this nondescript bird. They don't have all the really charming breeding behaviors that they do up here. Sometimes you'll hear them tremoloing or wailing down there, but not nearly as much as they do up here. And they're just really there to winter and to exist as much as possible. But in April, what you probably were observing was a juvenile loon, so not an adult loon, because the adults most of them have already, especially if it's by mid-April, most of them have already migrated north. So juvenile loons also, as you could see in that picture, I can show you, let's see here.
Yeah, we had wondered if it was injured somehow, but now based on your presentation, I realized that it was, because neither one of us, including the boat driver, knew that they hung out down there for 3 years before they headed north again.
Yeah, and not many people are aware of that. It's really just the researchers who are aware of that. But as we do more and more of these presentations, folks learn about that too. But it's fascinating what some of that satellite telemetry has revealed too about the juveniles' movements as well. But yeah, you probably were observing juvenile loons probably right before they were about to migrate north to colder waters.
And does every loon shed its plumage like that before it leaves? Because this one still had its little tuxedo on versus all the other ones that didn't.
Oh, so you were probably so the time of year that you were there is kind of unusual. So the loons do acquire their breeding plumage. A lot of them, not their entire breeding plumage, but a lot of their breeding plumage when they're down south before they migrate up north. And so you were probably seeing an adult loon right before it was migrating. It was probably a much later migration for that adult loon. But they generally, when they go down to the Gulf of Mexico, they look like this juvenile loon. There are some subtle differences between the adults and the juveniles. For instance, the adults have a darker bill. You can see this juvenile has sort of a whitish edge on its feathers, and they're more squared off feathers, and the adults have roundish feathers that don't have that white edge to it. But and then the adults have a much brighter white breast too when they're in their non-breeding plumage, but they definitely have non-breeding plumage. But that time of year, I was actually, I wish I had another PowerPoint that I could share with you that I could bring up right now, but I was actually down in South Carolina in early March of 2020, right about the time that COVID just took off. But we were on a reservoir called Lake Jocassee, and we were observing loons in all different types of plumage, and some of them were pretty close to migrating. And so you could see the, as you call the black and white collar and the black and white plumage. It's the head that actually gets the last of the breeding plumage before it migrates north. But that's a great question. Yeah, they look, I call them the Walt Disney species of the north, but when they get down to the area where there is Walt Disney, they don't look anything like they do up here.
Yeah, we kind of learned that the hard way. We thought it looked more like a merganser than a loon, but thank you very much for answering that. We were very fascinated by that. And like I said, I don't know if I was the only one that didn't know that, but I had no idea that they changed their plumage when they came and went.
Yeah, and common mergansers are probably the bird that are more often mistaken for loons, even up here. Because, up here when mergansers are in their breeding plumage, they have that black back and white breast, and they sit kind of similar into the water like a loon, but they have that really distinctive hooked red bill. But from a distance, in bright light or low light or fog or different weather conditions, it's kind of easy to mistake them unless you have a pair of binoculars and you're able to get a good look. You can mistake a merganser for a loon. They're definitely smaller than loons though. But that's great observation. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I have a question. I think early on you mentioned some of the predators, one being the gull, but I didn't quite understand. There's qualification there. Sometimes when I've gone up late May, in the middle of the night, it sounds like the gulls and the loons have declared war. It's just blood curdling, and my theory, I guess, was the gulls were maybe attacking the nest or attacking, looking for the chicks or something. But I don't know if you can confirm or deny that.
It's possible. The gulls are probably going after the loon eggs is what they go for. During the night, though, what we hear often are territorial disputes, and so that yodel that you heard, there will be a lot of that, and that's you'll hear a lot of ruckus, and sometimes you'll hear wailing and tremoloing as well. But probably my guess would be that was probably a territorial dispute.
Not so much an attack or. Okay.
Sometimes when predators attack, the loons get very upset too, and then you see this empty nest, and probably what happened was a predator, and it's difficult to discern exactly which predator. There are some defining characteristics by looking at eggshell fragments or a lack of eggshell fragments, depending on different predators. But probably a gull would be attacking in the daytime, would be my guess.
Well, you could hear I can often hear the gulls. I mean, so the gulls and the loons. So the territory and the what are you, tremolos or the yodels. Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Erica, I have a question. I don't, my computer's kind of funky, so I'm not sure you can see me, but my question is whether or not, so we have a cabin that we inherited a couple of years ago, and it's on Half Moon Lake in Wisconsin, and there are loon population there. It's a spring-fed lake. So would there be somebody at that particular lake that is assigned to the loon protection, or somebody that monitors where they nest? Is there some kind of, I don't know if you'd say charting, or some kind of, just volunteers is there any list anywhere that would tell us that?
So the monitoring is completely voluntary if they want to participate in the LoonWatch annual lakes monitoring program. And I do carry a database. For privacy concerns, I wouldn't be able to give you the name of the person, but
Sure.
But I can look up and tell you whether or not there is a loon ranger on your lake.
Okay.
But again, if you're interested in becoming the loon ranger, I'd be happy to walk you through the steps of becoming a volunteer loon ranger on the lake. Or if you know someone who might be interested in that.
Yeah, I for sure do it, or there's somebody else on the lake that might do it too. So yeah.
But there are actually a lot of half moon lakes. Which county are you in?
It's Polk County. Do you know where Balsam Lake is? That's more popular?
Yes.
Okay, this is the lake just north of that. That is Spring-fed Lake that feeds Balsam Lake. All the water from Balsam Lake comes from Half Moon Lake. So we have a lot of springs, fresh springs, and we have a hidden lake kind of that you can only get into with canoes and kayaks. So a big habitat, bird habitat.
We do have loon rangers on that lake.
Okay.
So I am familiar with that lake, and but it's always nice to have a team.
Yeah.
So to have more than one loon ranger in case someone's going on vacation or something happens, or just to split up the duties can be really nice. So I can contact those folks and see if and I'm sure they would. I know they're very nice folks.
I might even know
become a loon ranger
some
team.
of them
Yeah,
are. So
you might. Yeah, there's an active
I just didn't know.
association on that lake.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey, Erica, this is Rob. Great presentation. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
I have a question about the pebbles that they pick up to help digestion. I'm wondering how long that lasts. How do I say? Do they have to pick up pebbles several times in a season, or how often do they do that? Do they ever expel them, or can you explain more about that, please?
That is a really good question. I know a wildlife vet who he's an expert in loons, and I'll ask him. I don't know the answer to that question. So actually, I'm going to write that down and ask him.
Part of the thought behind it was just how much chance do they have of picking up, lead sinkers if they're like doing it every day or month or whatever. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question.
There's a question in the chat asking about whether a large northern or muskie can actually eat a loon or just the chicks.
It would only go after the chicks. The chicks are small enough where that's just a little bite of protein. But loons are huge. They're 30 inches from head to tail. It would have to be a monster muskie to potentially go after a loon. Not saying that couldn't happen, but very unlikely.
Can you tell us what the average or typical lifespan is of a loon?
Oh, that's a great question. Their typical lifespan is 25 to 30 years. They're a long-lived species, but there is a loon couple in the Saney National Wildlife Refuge in Michigan, and they are currently the longest-lived recorded loons in the world that we know of. And I believe, shouldn't quote me, I believe they are 34 and 37 years old, and they are still producing chicks. So incredible.
Wow, that's great. Any other questions?
Hey, this is Brian. I'm just curious. I know with your chart you were showing that throughout the years the breeding's going to start moving further north, but I have noticed kind of I guess call it a Lake Minnetonka effect around a lot of lakes in Minnesota, where they're doing a lot of like huge home constructions and eating up all the shorelines and stuff like that. And it seems to be expanding out. Is there worry that just because of human expansion, we're gonna start taking up some critical habitat, or is there like, or have people already made moves to protect?
We already have. Loons used to breed in northern Ohio, northern Indiana, northern Illinois, and Iowa, and development pressure and poor water quality have pushed them up to the areas where they're existing today. So if loons don't have a place to breed on the lakes, if the lake is so developed there's no place for them to nest, then they're not going to be there. There is kind of a solution, an artificial nesting platform. It's not always the best solution, and the loons don't always take to it. So potentially in Minnetonka that would be a solution, but yes, development is probably one of the biggest threats to loons.